Welcome to the Travis Masterbone podcast. I am your host, Travis Masterbone, talking some shit to impact your life. This is episode 18, titled Ray Dalio and the Changing World Order. Part 2, quote, "To understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you." End quote. Ray Dalio. If you don't know who he is, tune into part 1. Google him, YouTube him. We will be analyzing even further his book, The Changing World Order. That quote / principle that I just said right there represents the overall foundation of his philosophy towards finances and life. We will zoom in specifically on financial aspects and how this principle applies to his definition of the world order. But we're also going to get a little bit deeper on analyzing specific empires. Okay, and so the whole purpose and point of this is just to study the past to anticipate the future. And we're going to get a little bit more into the actual changing orders. The last episode, I was breaking down currency devaluation and talking about gold and getting off the gold standard, and more so catering to the United States. But I would like to point out that whole first episode, when we start talking about patterns, and today we will talk about the big cycle when it comes to empires rising and declining. That whole first part 1, really does cater to what a government does or what a country does in times of a crisis and printing money. This is a part of the decline within that cycle, and I'll get a little bit more into that moving forward. But changing orders. Ray Dalio, over the last few years, he noticed 3 things occur, and it prompted him to write this book and embark on these really detailed studies on these countries. And so the first one is what I just said. Countries that didn't have enough money to pay their debts, even after the Federal Reserve lowered their interest rates down to 0, countries that don't have enough money to pay their debts, they usually go to, like I just said, printing money. Or what I mentioned in the last episode, or episode 16, quantitative easing is the fancy pants term that they will use, or QE. It just means that they're fucking printing money. Okay, so that's one thing that he really noticed that we need to understand. And if it doesn't work after the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates down to 0%, the whole point of lowering it to 0% is to entice citizens to borrow money, go and purchase homes, invest, business developments, and basically facilitate productivity and grow the economy. So when this doesn't happen, it's a stalemate. And so we're operating under a fiat currency right now. Again, which means it's not backed by anything. When we got off the gold standard in 1971, that's what the paper dollars were for. They were to exchange at the bank for a certain amount in gold. Okay, so just keep this in mind. When they're printing money, it's just a matter of time until things really, really get bad. How far do we kick the can down the road, printing a bunch of paper dollars that aren't backed by anything? The second thing that he noticed, internal conflicts emerge. And one in particular that we will notice on the decline when we start talking about patterns in this cycle is the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Right, top 10% versus the bottom 90%. This has been an ongoing conflict forever, basically, okay? The left thinks that the right is a bunch of greedy capitalist pigs, and the right points the finger saying the left is lazy and unproductive and doesn't deserve handouts because it jeopardizes the entire ship as a whole, okay? And so the left wants to redistribute wealth, and the right wants to defend and protect those that have it and have earned it. And so he noticed that, number 2. And then number 3 is the increasing external conflicts, highlighting this hierarchy of changing orders, world powers, right? And so this would be war, right? The increasing in external conflicts. So we got these main principles that he's kind of identified and noticed, and he's putting together these patterns, right? The crisis, printing money, internal conflict, going to external conflict. We are going to get into grave detail today. So let's get into it. All right. What exactly is a world order? A world order is a global governing system on how people just basically deal with each other, how countries deal with each other. And if you break it down, you have it within our own countries as well, internal order. So within the U.S., there's order within states, counties, cities, all governed through systems, processes, laws, constitutions, right? And so on the global scale, countries use treaties, okay? And we need to just keep all of this in mind when it comes to order, especially when certain superpowers in history get replaced by other superpowers. And then what do we use, or more specifically, what does Ray Dalio use as metrics to define what a superpower is, what qualifies someone to be at the top, and how do they get replaced? And so internal conflicts, we see things that get as violent and extreme as civil wars. Revolutions do occur. External conflicts, we see world wars. But essentially, we have to keep in mind that the new forces will always defeat the older, weaker forces, right? Or the more vulnerable they become. And with these cycles, we will see that inevitably in the past, empires do end up becoming a bit more vulnerable, and then rising countries in a different phase of their cycles will emerge and challenge the big dog. Okay, and so we see examples of internal orders such as the United States, the 1789, the American Revolution. In Russia, we see the Bolsheviks from 1970 ending in 1991, relatively bloodless. And there's plenty of other examples throughout history. Take a dive, go for it. And then external obvious examples would be World War II, where the U.S. and allies were victorious in World War II against Germany, Japan, etc., and Russia. And so that is a time where the U.S. really emerged as the dominant world power. And so they set up global treaties, systems, and agreed upon monetary policies. This was all specifically set in the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which established the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. So winning the World War and then establishing yourself as a world reserve currency, these are some metrics that Ray Dalio highlights that allows or makes a country specifically a world power, okay? And the reserve currency is specifically a currency that is commonly accepted around the world. And having one is key to an empire rising to the top. So what exactly is the top? What is all this talk about cycles? Well, let's get into it. The big cycle, just imagine a giant arch. We have a rise, we have a top, we have a decline. Okay, and so the rise starts with a new world order. So World War II, the U.S. wins. It becomes a dominant superpower, and then it starts to creep up through peace, prosperity, and productivity. But then that starts to translate into a financial bubble. And then there's a wealth gap between the haves and have-nots. And I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Just before that, it establishes as a reserve currency. Incomes rise, and competitors like to copy the country that's doing well. And then the bubble occurs. Then the wealth gap occurs. And so the tip top of that cycle starts to decline. We'll see a financial bust, economic downturn, crisis. There's the crisis. So what happens when a crisis ensues? We see the printing of money. We see extremes such as revolutions and wars due to internal conflicts and political disagreement. And also it's always a thing with the money, the haves and the have-nots. And sometimes it gets as bad as a actual war, external conflict. And then you see New World Order, and then it rinses and repeats. And so Ray doesn't just pull this out of his ass. He has studied the top 10 most powerful empires throughout our history. And in this book, he only specifically focuses on the rise and fall of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and decline of the dollar within the U.S., but then also he studies the decline of China, but right now is on the rise. And so he also studied the Spanish, the German, the Indian, French, Japanese, Russian, Ottoman empires, and much, much more. And so he has identified the patterns and these cycles throughout history at one point in time, okay? And so these big cycles, they last roughly between 250 years from rise to top to decline with those similar symptoms that I just rattled off for you. There's about 10 to 20 year transition periods between them, and he picked these 4 specific empires because he highlights how the Dutch had its phase first, and then it transitioned into a new superpower within the order, the British, and then the U.S., and now he's hinting at the rise of China. And so typically these transitions have occurred involving the actual physical conflict, violent wars, leading to powers, because the leading powers, they don't want to just lay down without a fight. When they start to creep on the downside of their cycle, while other countries are on the up phase in their peak, those leading superpowers, they don't want to just lay down without a fight. And so with all this being said, all this jibber jab and nonsense, I think the most important things that I want to ask is, how exactly are you measuring these things, Mr. Dalio, you brilliant mind? What exactly is your standards and measurements and metrics for a country and their power, right? And so in his studies, he identifies 8 specific metrics, and I'm going to list them off and then we're going to go over them a little bit, but it essentially does make sense. The 8 metrics include education, inventiveness and technological development, competitiveness in global markets, economic outputs, productivity, the share of this country or empire on the world trade stage, military strength and size, the power of their financial centers for capital markets, and then the strength of their currency as a reserve currency, as I mentioned earlier. So these 8 are all measurable. And Ray points out by analyzing these metrics, we can see how a country operates and has operated in the past, but then more importantly, how the future looks in regards to the overall well-being of that empire and stability on the world stage. And so he uses plenty of charts and plenty of stats and data to further back why he picked these 8 specific metrics. He does it all quite beautifully and simplifies it to where you're not blowing your brain out trying to understand and comprehend all of this. But for the most part, it is really, really a great book full of details. I highly recommend it, especially if you're really, really interested in history and how empires work and how he's really viewing it through this rise and fall. So let's wrap back to those 8 metrics really quick and why they are important on that big cycle. And so when on the rise, right, the new world order emerges after a conflict such as a war. This could be internally or internationally. We will see a change in government or regime internally or on the global stage, a world superpower, right, on that rise. And this leads to education, better education. And this will also transition into increased innovation and technological development, right? New inventions. And this will lead to a much more competitiveness in the global markets, more productivity, economic output. And then that leads to a bigger share of world trade. And this gives you more options as a country to build a stronger military to defend yourself. And in case shit hits the fan, go to war without putting your country in the hole financially. And then this increases the power of your financial centers for capital markets, for people to borrow against your reserve currency, which is now center stage utilized all over the world. So this is the step-by-steps in the metrics on reaching the top within that big cycle. Okay, so on that rise, they emerge. When the victory ensues, nobody wants to challenge this new leadership. And that makes sense, right? After a revolution or after a war is won, it's dark times. You finally see the light. The new regime or new world power is in play. And everything's optimistic and nobody wants to challenge the winner. So there's a period of peace, prosperity. We're on this upside in the cycle. And productivity follows, all fueled by the promises and visions of the new leadership. And it's followed by those who believe in it. People bet on this increase. People bet. People invest, right? They see the prosperity, they feel the productivity, and they want to be a part of it. How do they do that? How do they expedite the process? The whole point of borrowing money is leveraging it so you could do things quickly, expedite expansion. So a lot of borrowing, a lot of loans are pulled out, all towards financing towards this expansion on this up phase within your country. Okay? But this inevitably will always lead to a bubble. Why? Well, like Ray Dalio says, people push it, okay? And now we're creeping towards the top, okay? The financial bubble starts to build, but it doesn't mean the decline is near, right? The empire's share of trade globally grows and when more of the empire's transactions all over the world are conducted using its currency, whether at the time it's the Dutch Empire and the guilder or the British with the pound and the US dollar, it becomes that reserve currency, something reliable and stable, recognizable and usable. So here we are at the top. The bubble is inflated. It leads to even more borrowing once the reserve currency is established. Once that bubble bursts, it is inevitable. And then we see the wealth gap. That is also inevitable. The haves versus the have-nots. The disparities always grow, according to Ray Dalio and his analyzing of empires. There's always some type of bubble, always some type of bust, and it's followed up with crisis. And remember, when there's a financial crisis, what do the governments do? They've all done it, from the Dutch, the British, the U.S. In comes quantitative easing, aka printing of money. This is where we see the downside, and that's why I had to mention part one was a lot to do with the downside, but I don't think I clarified it enough that we're talking about this big cycle. And of course, with all that ensuing, increasing tensions occur between the rich and the poor, political tensions, whatever the topics may be, but it's always predominantly fueled by the redistribution of wealth versus those protecting it. Again, as mentioned earlier. And it could get as crazy as leading to a revolution or some change in power. This could be peacefully, like that Russian example in 1991, relatively, or it could be a full-blown civil war, like the American Civil War for our Constitution. And so this has happened in the past. But while the empire is on this down slope of the cycle, the big cycle, the empire struggles with all of these internal conflicts. But in the meantime, we have to be aware other countries, a good example right now is China, who's on the up and up, starts to build and sees a vulnerable leader, not looking so much as a leader anymore, dealing with all of this internal conflict. Okay, so the new rising power gets strong enough to compete and, worst case scenario, fight against this diminishing superpower, typically in wars as an external conflict. And so the whole point is then emerges new winners and new losers. And then the winners, again, much like the Bretton Woods Agreement, they create a new world order, new reserve currency, and there's a new change in world power. And I just find it absolutely fascinating and interesting, and I just love the way he puts this all together. And then the whole damn thing just repeats itself. Pretty cool. And so these cause and effect cycles, have occurred in all of these empires that Ray has pointed out and studied in this book. Again, this is a very simplified explanation and summary of a man who is really simplifying and summarizing his deep, in-depth studies. So if you want to get a little bit more detail, I suggest watching his videos on this book and actually purchasing the book and reading it yourself. God forbid. He did give a really interesting analogy that I think summarized it quite nicely. It was an analogy about the human life cycle, how it's very similar to the empire's big cycle, rise and decline. He makes the point, and you've probably already been thinking this, no two humans are exactly the same, and no two countries are exactly the same, but most are similar. And so it's driven by a logical cause and effect relationship. And so we see this big cycle for the empires, but we also see it in a human, right? The birth, the early rise, adolescence, and then getting to the top, maturity, in the middle, and then you end up being an elderly, weakening, and eventually dying in the decline stages. And so the age range, of course, it's not always exactly the same, but we have an average life of 80 years. But depending on lifestyle habits and genetics and other parameters, some unfortunately make it to only 40, 50, 60 years old. And then there's outliers that surpass that to 90, 100, and beyond, right? So age is a good indicator of future longevity, but a better way is to look at health indicators, right? And so these are the metrics that we were talking about earlier, right? Ray says it simply. We can use this same exact logic and reasoning with the empires, looking at their vitals, those 8 metrics: education, inventiveness and technological development, competitiveness in global markets, economic outputs, aka productivity, and then your share of world trade, so you get across the entire world, your military strength, and then the power of your financial centers, and then the strength of your currency as a reserve currency. So just think of those as your vitals, and it's synonymous with a doctor checking the vitals of yourself during a checkup, right? And so I thought it was a really good analogy to kind of cap this whole thing off here. But yeah, you'll basically be able to see the shape of an empire in its specific stage in the cycle, and you'll be more equipped to anticipate what is coming next. Again, that opening quote, to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you. So this book is phenomenal. I can't recommend it enough. I can't recommend you diving into the mind of Ray Dalio. He is one of my favorites in regards to mentors that I've never met. His books, his philosophies, etc. Some people call him a big doomsday guy now. It is what it is. Everyone's got their opinions, and I think he's a really, really smart individual. Damn billionaire. Listen to part 1. Cap this off. Hopefully you grabbed a notepad and pen and not a pillow. But again, as always, please like, share, subscribe, all that shit. And thank you for listening to the Travis Masterbone podcast. And I look forward to you tuning in next time. Farewell.